So welcome everyone. I'm Maziyar Ghiabi from the SOAS Drugs and Disorder Project. The project is about studying illicit drug economies and conflict and ways in which the drug economy can foster peace building and sort of better livelihoods for communities affected by the drug economy. Today we'll have a conversation with Camilo, Diana, and Tim from our project. Camilo and Diana are from the Universidad Nacional de Colombia. They are researchers in politics, and they have been working on the Colombia case. Our project includes also other countries, including Afghanistan and Myanmar. And then we have Tim from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, who is a public health sociologist. The conversation will be around how COVID has impacted borderland communities and more general our own project and how we can carry out a complex project, a multi-layered project in pandemic times. So the first question I wanted to ask you, Camilo, is how have borderland communities reorganized their economic and social activities in the face of the pandemic? Particularly, I mean, if we can think about the impact of those communities most affected by the illicit drug economy.
So, hi Masi, hi Diana, Tim. What we are able to know is that initially, at least in the first few months of the pandemic, many peasants who lived between the town and the rural sector went to their farms to avoid contagion. There, they continued with their coca crops, but the problems they faced was that there were not many buyers. I mean, coca paste buyers, because of mobility restrictions. There was a period when the coca growers could not sell the product and had to store it for a while. And without the income from coca, many relied on their legal crops or on the solidarity of their neighbors to at least guarantee food. But I think that it wasn't all restrictions. In this period, there has also been a lot of social mobilization by the communities. On the one hand, there are the mobilization against the forced eradications of coca crops, and that is something we will surely discuss later, I think. And in Putumayo, that is one of the regions where we are working on right now. There was also a mobilization of indigenous groups that installed their own checkpoints at the entrance to the towns to ensure that citizens were complying with the sanitary measures. And this was done autonomously and apparently without coordination with the local government. So this on the one hand, we have these very harsh economic conditions, but on the other side, we have social mobilizations by the communities.
That's excellent. Thank you. And I think the sort of tension between hardship and solidarity is something that we've seen across the world and in these times, and something I think social scientists will definitely look at. Diana, I mean, if we look at instead the patterns of actual everyday interactions and how people organize, actually, do we have any sort of examples from the borderland communities you've been working on, how they have coped with this, or how even state institutions, on the other hand, have coped with it, or the other great entity in our sort of study, which is illegal, armed groups, guerrilla, as well as criminal organizations?
Well, I think I'm in charge of this study case in Tumaco, where there are like these Afro-Colombian communities. So I know, and I heard that some leaders at some of those communities organized for the COVID. So they created like these committees or these small groups to control the trade, the mobilization of people. I think that was a really, I think those base organizations improved some conditions and were able to face that COVID impacts. So I think that in Tumaco, we can see these advances, but I really don't know how it works for the actual Cocalero communities. I think it was a really, I think these Afro-Colombian communities were able to manage in a really good way the COVID impacts in these ways in order to organize them, to prevent the entry of people, and to restrict some mobilizations types of things. But actually I really don't know how work the everyday in the pandemic situation for the cocalero growers, more than Camilo has already explained to us.
Thank you. Thanks, Diana. I mean, this is an excellent point, I think. And one of the things I was thinking about is, of course, the pandemic has affected, the health of people, but there is also a growing question about what will the post-pandemic economic situation be. And that is a situation in which communities that are already facing hardship on different levels may look at the coca economy as a major source for livelihoods as well as developmental objectives. Is this something that's been discussed, do you think, in the borderlands or among communities that you're studying? How can the coca economy actually provide where state authorities are not capable of intervening?
Yeah, I think that for sure, many people and many peasants in our regions rely on coca because for them, the state has not provided any of the things that they need, for example, water or electricity. So they see this as the fount of how they could earn a livelihood. But I think that the big impacts of COVID on drug economy or in coke economy, people experienced in the first months, because after 3 or 4 months, maybe in June or July, I think that things has gone back to what it was maybe a year ago. All these restrictions in mobility were relaxed, so people could again go to their farms and work in their coca crops. But we think that it's very possible that for many peasants that were not working with coca before pandemic, maybe after all these conditions happened, after the pandemic, they will have to go and get involved with coca economy, because even legal crops were damaged or were affected, because there were a decrease in legal markets in our regions. So people has not money to buy even food. So maybe we will see in a couple of months or maybe in a year an increase of coca crops in borderlands, because of all the negative impact that it has in peasants that work with legal crops.
Just to add a few comments, Masi, I think that beyond the impacts on the COVID on these borderland communities and the cocalero growers, I think that for our peasant sector, the COVID has had this negative impact on the general growers and peasants in Colombia, because the markets were really affected for the restrictions, for mobility, for the mobilization of people. And I think we were able to see some, as Camilo said, some mobilization of different sectors. For example, like in November, October, we saw how the potato sector had to go to had to do this strike for the terrible conditions that the pandemic has been affecting them. And I think it is a really chance that these peasants or this rural sector see in the coca crops like a really good opportunity to improve their livelihoods due to this pandemic situation. So I think our agrarian or rural sector is always in crisis, but I think this pandemic has worsened those conditions for the rural communities in general, not only for the cocalero growers. So I think that perhaps we can see in a few years maybe an increase on the coca crops and also on the cocaleros growers.
To complement for the losses, and also to it will also depend on the situation beyond Colombia's borders, and how will the coca economy will evolve, and the trafficking routes will evolve in the coming years in Venezuela, for instance, or
yeah.
So the big questions we haven't really touched upon is the question which often comes to mind to everyone who is not actually working on drugs, but they sort of are interested in, so like the Netflix audience, let's say, which is the question of violence. How has violence changed, evolved, regressed since the pandemic started? There are reports, of course, that criminal organizations, militias have intervened to kill community leaders and other social activists. But it would be interesting to hear more from people who actually have been doing research on the ground.
Yeah, well, the responses of non-state armed groups, at least in Putumayo, that is a borderland located at the south of the country, near Ecuador, have been very mixed. Initially, they sought to enforce the sanitary standards imposed by the government, especially curfews. They were even much more punitive, I think, and reportedly went so far as to threaten people who appear to have COVID. And in addition, they moved to the border with Ecuador to keep out the inhabitants of that country, which in the initial months was one of the countries with the highest number of infections in the region. But perhaps, as you mentioned, Masi, the most visible response has been the threats to peasant leaders. And in Putumayo, threats have increased during the pandemic, and armed groups have a strategic advantage now because many leaders were unable to move, especially in the early months when restrictions on citizen movement were greatest. They were more exposed than before, when they could change their residence or even leave the territories. So in this case, the state's response to protect social leaders have been very poor. And they excuse themselves by saying that because of the pandemic, they cannot attend to leaders any faster. So I believe that in Putumayo, at least, that mixture of pandemic, confrontation of armed groups, and state neglect is going to have lasting effects after all this pandemic. After the pandemic, at least in the social mobilization of the peasants. Some social organizations have already announced that they will stop their activities because of the threats. So yeah, it's a very difficult situation right now.
So you started in the initial part of our conversation to refer to how hardship was met to a certain extent with solidarity. Yeah. And people's mutual help. But on the other hand, we see that to a certain extent, the pandemic has not depoliticized in the strict sense of the word, but it has demobilized some of the organizations that were very much active on the ground. Is it correct? This assumption?
Not really the pandemic, but the violence of some non-state armed groups that right now has, I think, a strategic advantage because, as I mentioned, social leaders right now cannot move very freely. So they are in a good, these armed groups are in a good position to threaten them. And most of these organizations, at least the biggest ones in the south of the country, are saying that they will stop activities because the level of threat is so high right now. So they prefer to just make a step outside and stay quiet for now.
Jana, did you want to add something on this?
I think in our Colombian case, this topic about violence was really important in the sense that we saw this increase in the massacres. Yeah, that is the word, right? Massacres, and had a really like important impact on the media and on some NGOs and human rights organizations. But yes, like from August to November, we see like this important increase in massacres. Some of these massacres were committed for, I think that was like the media reported, for these quarantine restrictions that were violated. For example, I remember a massacre that was really, really cruel, where were murdered like 9 young men and women for this small party in a rural, in the countryside, in one of the municipalities of Colombia, and was committed by this armed group that we really don't know who were the actor. But I think yes, like from August to November, we saw this increase in massacres, and we also see in regarding the coca economy and these borderland communities. I think we saw this increase in the state violence in these forced eradications campaigns. And we, like in March or May, I really don't remember well, we did this special about forced eradication and the confrontation between Cocalero peasants and the military forces. And we actually saw that increase in the violence. We registered murders, and we registered like a lot of types of violence committed by the state force against Cocalero peasants. And I think for a country who tries to make this transition from war to peace, and these Cocalero peasants that are involved in the alternative development program, I think was really serious, the situations in terms of violence, and this violence committed by the state forces. So I think we saw this increase too in terms of violence. Yeah.
Excellent, excellent. Yes, and this is, I think, something that is really worth exploring more. I mean, and see also the connections between state neglect, I think, as Camilo said, in another dimension, which would have been that of the economy, maybe, and the hyperactivism of the gray zone of those who operate on beyond the radar of the public eye, so or illegal organizations of all sorts. So I think that's an excellent thing. But another point, which I think, which is more interesting probably for those who actually happen to do research in times with COVID, and I think this is something that also Tim would be able to help us with, is the challenges of actually doing research in the conditions created by the pandemic. So, we are well aware that, people carrying out research on the illegal drug economy and, of course, in conflict zones face an enormous set of problems. But what are the new problems created by the pandemic? I mean, specifically in reference to our own project, which happens to be global, looking at borderlands and therefore communities that often, are already more difficult to study than the capital.
On the question of research methods, Mazzy, I think it's a really good one, because the Drugs and Disorder project that we're all involved in kind of has an ethnographic sensibility, which draws on the idea of, by getting close to one's social world, and if not getting immersed in it in some way, we can learn from it very closely. And I think that does become much more difficult, obviously, in a pandemic situation when you can't travel or even have social or close contact with people. So the question of how you do ethnography, how you learn from that kind of social immersion in the community you are studying in a pandemic situation is a really good question. Now, it's not to say you can't do digital versions of ethnography. Of course you can, and some projects lend themselves to more digital data than others. But I think, speaking personally, what I will miss most likely, unless we can find another way of doing it, and maybe we can discuss this, is just being there, you know, just seeing and feeling and having a kind of a close enough sense of an environment which helps to understand it. And I always find with my own qualitative interviewing that the closer I am to the place in which the interviews themselves relate, you know, the richer the accounts are, you know, because they connect with a place in some way. And doing that virtually and by distance, I think is really quite challenging. So I'm interested to hear what you both think in terms of how close can we get to experience? How close can we get to appreciating or having a sense of an environment if we have to move to more distant forms of data generation? And to what extent do you feel you're able to do ethnography in Putumayo and other places?
Well, I think that definitely we are not so even close to practice ethnography right now. But for us, it has been very useful to use video call platforms to do virtual interviews. Of course, it has a lot of limitations, but definitely it's not much an innovation, but it has been very useful for us in these months. And I think that one of the advantages of virtual interviews is that they are much more flexible than a face-to-face interview could be. For example, we are doing right now a set of live stories with Cocalero leaders. And since the live stories require more than one session, either 4 or 5 sessions, in normal situations, it would have been very difficult to adjust the schedules with the interviewees. But with the virtuality, it has been much easier. Obviously, these virtual interviews have many limits, as Tim mentioned. But as long as there is a good internet connections, I think it could be very productive, at least as a second options during the pandemic time. But I think that right now we have the advantage that we have not been so far away from the field during this time. For example, in Putumayo, there are 2 elements in our favor, I think. First, there are this network of contacts that we had built up in previous years, and that have served to inform us about what is happening and to do some virtual interviews, as I mentioned. And in addition, we have a research assistant who lives in Putumayo, and who throughout this time has kept a field diary and has systematically followed up on the issues that interest us. So in fact, much of what I have said today is because of the information from him. So we have tried to use these like kind of networks and the field diary and all the information provided by our research assistant there that help us to at least try to, in some cases, triangulate different kind of informations and not to be really so far away from the field.
I think
I think this connects. Sorry, Tim.
No, I was just going to say I shouldn't interrupt, Mazzy, but I was just going to say that's a great response, Camilo. And the idea of looking at different ways to make things local, and the idea of kind of creating more of a participatory input into kind of the research collaboration. And it makes me think there's all sorts of other ways of doing that, probably through diary keeping, through, as you say, field notes. Maybe local participants themselves are facilitated to do their own visual ethnographies of their local environments. So there's many other ways, I think.
Yeah, for example, not just to really, of course, interact with people who live in there, but also following up the local press and social networks. I think that both the press and, the local press and social networks are a good window to get new information about public events such as forced eradication, mobilization, etc. So, there is a lot of things in the internet that we can use also to try to figure it out what is happening in the field right now, beyond the interactions with people who live in there.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And just thinking more variably as well in terms of what constitutes a method, that we don't only think about interviews and the virtual interview, but there's many other materials to draw on.
Yes, and it's exactly what Tim was saying, the importance of being there. So since we are not capable of being there physically often, we have to act by proxy. So we, mobilize our friends, our networks. To a certain degree, I think one tool which may be very useful is the observation of social media as well. It's a sort of soft listening. They call it in the intelligence community, which I'm not part of, but I observe them very closely. For instance, if people in Putumayo or Tumaco use social media, Instagram, and post about things such as eradication or any other intervention in public life, then we can have a sense of things going on there while not being there, because we are prevented from doing basically anything, at least in the UK. That's I think a very important point. One of the things I think I had, and I think this is the final question before we close up. I think talking with one of your colleagues, Francisco, he mentioned that the pandemic generated certain conditions that made possible interviews with people in the illicit drug economy who would have otherwise been unreachable. Is this something you could comment on, or are you familiar with this example brought in by Francisco?
People were able and have the time to do the interview, even by a cell phone call.
Yeah.
It was not necessary to have access to internet. I think in my case, the majority of these virtual interviews were phone calls. So I think, yes, these restrictions allow us to reach some people, especially those leaders that are not in our study regions. So Camilo and myself are doing these interviews with COCA leaders from other regions of Colombia. So I think, yes, this quarantine facilitate us to do these interviews with these people that perhaps our field work in our study regions sometimes reduce our spectrum,
accessibility,
our range. Yeah. So yeah, we try to be creative and start to once again do this list of contacts, and I think it was really important to do that. So yeah, I mean, the restriction of fieldworks allow us to think in other people and in other contexts. And I think in our case too, we try to fill that void of the fieldwork doing this legal strategy that we were able to implement. So, and it was really important because it allowed us to maintain that contact with Cocalero leaders. So we started to do these meetings regarding the legal procedures and the legal strategy in order to suspend post-eradication and the returning of aerial spraying with glyphosate. And I think we had a lot of meetings that maybe in normal times we were able to do this, because sometimes people were used to translate from Bogota to Bogota or to other spaces, you know, to do these physical meetings. But I think these virtual meetings were really important, even for the organizations, the COCA organizations, to improve their movement. So I think, yes, this really facilitate us some access to some kind of data. Of course, our field work were suspended, so we weren't able to register our observations, to keep these, to maintain this kind of data of the observation that we registered in field, but we try to compensate that work.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Unless anyone else want to comment on things we talked about so far, I would.
I think that, just to add something, I think that the pandemic in general forced us to explore all the sources of information available on the web. And as you mentioned, Mazi, social media definitely is a very good source to access to all kind of information of our regions. For example, I remember in June, maybe there was a huge mobilization in Putumayo of coca growers that were fighting against eradications. And this mobilization was transmitted via streaming. So we can actually see all the developings of all the develops of the mobilization. We see it at lifetime. I mean, we were able to look what is happening right now. And after that mobilization, they even installed a virtual dialogue table with the government, and it was also transmitted via Facebook. So we can actually capture this information via social media, and later, of course, try to analyze it.
Yeah. And one wonders what will be the sort of what will the experience that we are learning now, you know, in using these tools will be for our research after that, whether, you know, it will sediment and will gather more information, or we'll be so eager to go back to physical contact and actual observation in context that we'll forget about the digital.
Well, I think it will be a mix of that, Mazi, because as the pandemic goes on longer and as virtual communications become more of our new normal, as Camilo is saying, including in terms of how movements do their actions, how governments kind of relate or communicate with them, yeah, it will be probably the best way to get close to how things actually are, because it is how things are. So yeah, but for me, I can't wait to go back into the field.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that for all of us, we are in the same position.
Absolutely. We're waiting. We're looking forward to that moment.
And I think on this note, we can all you know, sort of wrap up with the idea that enough is enough. Let's go back to the field as soon as possible. Anyway, thank you very much for being part of this conversation. We will try to put it in context with other case studies and field sites in Myanmar and Colombia, and see how, you know, different or how similar the pandemic has made different parts of the world into maybe, you know, which is something might be very surprising in terms of methods, but also in terms of what is happening on the ground.
Maybe bring everybody together, Mazi.
And maybe bring everybody together.
Installment.
Yeah, absolutely.